It was recently World Book Day, and it gave me an opportunity and an excuse to run my fingers lovingly over my bookshelves and ponder on some of the books that have been most influential in my life, and some of the books that I've just loved so much I've gone back to over and over again. And I started thinking about the whole issue of stories and why they're so important to us. If you think about it, we all spend a lot of time engaged with stories, whether that's in the old-fashioned way of reading a book, or perhaps even more old-fashioned in terms of actually telling stories to each other, or whether it's to do with more modern ways of delivering stories through films, through online TV and all this kind of thing. We're all engaged in stories one way or another. And it's a very rare person who doesn't include stories somewhere in their life, either telling them or watching them or listening to them or devising them. We're all engaged with that. So why is that such an important thing for human beings? Well, I read some research about this many years ago, and much of the research, oddly enough, had been done on gorillas, because gorillas have massive brains. I mean, really massive compared to the number of things that you actually observe gorillas doing. Because gorillas are vegetarians, so they don't have to go and hunt their food. They don't have, they're not part of the predator food chain. So basically what they do is they wander around in family groups and they pick the vegetation and they eat it. So why do they need such big brains? So the researchers who looked at this eventually came to the conclusion that the reason why gorillas have such big brains is because they are a social species, because they don't operate just as individuals or even in tiny family groups. They operate in huge family groups. And so what that means is that there are inevitably squabbles between family members. There are disagreements over territory, over food, over partners, over, all the things that human families disagree over and squabble about. And the researchers came to the conclusion that the excessive size of the gorilla's brains was to do with this need to live in social groups. So, where am I going with this, you're thinking? Well, how do we learn about living as part of a society? We learn it from stories. And primitive cultures did this by telling stories to each other, sometimes real stories, sometimes the history of the society, and sometimes made-up stories that were invented to illustrate a particular point, or they were invented to amuse, to entertain, to inspire. And millennia later, that's still the reason why we have stories. The stories give us the opportunity to inhabit another world, however briefly, however strange that world may be, or however close it might be to the world that we live in. It gives us an opportunity to step outside of our day-to-day existence and experience something else. And in experiencing something else, we get empathy for people who might be in different circumstances. We get to experience something that might be exciting, might be completely novel, it might be something that inspires us then to work towards having that thing in our life. And so stories are not just an indulgence of downtime. Stories are actually one of the ways that we become successful as human beings, because they help us to interact with our fellow human beings. They help us to make sense of the world, and they help us to think about how we want the world to be. So next time you're not at work and you're thinking about putting your feet up and indulging in a little bit of story time, whether that's reading a story to your children before bed, or whether it's reading a novel for yourself or watching a story on the TV, you can tell yourself this is actually part of my human development. It's not just indulgence. So enjoy.